Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we reflect on the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of America's greatest railroad systems. Have your tickets out of the envelope? All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may yet one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the first time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, before we get started, I want you to go over to our YouTube and check us out there. It's at All Things Trains 4022 or All Things Trains USA. You can see our vlog series, hashtag On the Train, where we talk about our recent trip to New York City, where I got to see the New York Mets, hence why I'm wearing a New York Mets jersey. Retired the number 16 Dwight Gooden, but I took a train to get there, Amtrak's Vermonter, as well as the Long Island Railroad. So you won't want to miss out, and always follow us there on YouTube just to see what we are up to railroad-wise outside of the All Aboard Podcast. Now, it's fitting that I rode on a couple of key Pennsylvania Railroad routes. After all, the Long Island was controlled by the Pennsylvania Railroad for a large portion of existence, as well as their most famous line, the Northeast Corridor route, which Amtrak mostly uses today. And it's fitting because on Saturday, April 13th, the Pennsylvania Railroad turned 178 years old. And it was formed on April 13th, 1846 by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That is the date that they commonly recognize as being the foundation of that company. Now, to be clear, there were a variety of predecessors who dated back earlier, including the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad and Turnpike Company, which was chartered variously by the states of Maryland and Delaware because it passed through both in 1809 and 1810, and a portion of that remains in operation as part of Norfolk Southern's services today in the Delmarva Peninsula area. Now, the reason, though, we're talking about the Pennsylvania Railroad isn't just because of its birthday, but because it's been so very impactful in the fabric of our society, and it continues to be. And there's a lot of people that can talk about the Pennsylvania because it was so large, it was so influential in the time when it was operating, which ended on February 1st, 1968, so 1846 to 1968, as an independent company. I didn't really feel that it would be worth it to you for me to recover some of the things that people talk about with the Pennsylvania Railroad. But I want to talk about a few of its statistics and then get into why you might think of it as being a noteworthy company that impacts the way you live today in time. And so a little of those interesting stats. Now, in 1925, per Trains Magazine, it had 11,709 route miles. So it was quite a bit smaller than Norfolk Southern or CSX today, although it was a significant amount of trackage that was packed into a comparatively small place. And there we're talking about the northeastern and midwestern portions of the United States. We're thinking about, obviously, Pennsylvania, but New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, going down to Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and also Virginia, as well as the District of Columbia. Its payroll in 1975 was $373.8 million, which is equal to $6.7 billion today. Now, by contrast, Norfolk Southern, which operates just about twice as much track, close to twice as much track, although runs far fewer trains, its payroll is $2.8 billion. So you say, well, that clearly shows that Norfolk Southern is doing a lot better, but it's important to note that Norfolk Southern operates in a time where we have a substantial amount of advancement in terms of automation that the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't have. And look no further than the next time you see somebody doing track work, all the machines and whatnot that they employ, and the relatively small number of people who operate and oversee those machines, as opposed to, for example, having to use spike mauls to drive spikes in, remove ties by hand, put new ties in by hand, and the most quote-unquote automation you might have gotten was being able to carry the rail aboard another train. So that shows you the labor, a lot of advances have been made in labor over the years to help lower that cost, which is traditionally and still is the biggest cost for railroads overall. Another interesting statistic on the Pennsylvania, going to the same things here, are overall revenues. Now, the carrier in 1925, when it had that 11,709 route miles, did $672.1 million in revenue, and today that would be equal to $12.1 billion. And that is equal to what Norfolk Southern did in 2023, $12.1 billion. And in case you're wondering, the reason why I'm continuing to mention Norfolk Southern as a comparison is that a substantial amount of the Pennsylvania, at least its main line traffic, is currently operated by the NS after the Conrail split in 1999. And so the most notable part of that is the famed Middle Division, which goes between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh over Horseshoe Curve. That is commonly thought of as being the heart of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a lot of that, of course, is part of the NS. Now, the Pennsylvania variously controlled several Class 1 carriers. And that, to me, is the thing that is so interesting about it. We look at it, the Standard Railroad of the world, and the Tuscan Red, and Brunswick Green, and so on, but we always forget that there were so many other railroads in its orbit that if it had taken over those, it would be a super railroad that is probably bigger than any other in the world, outside of course, India. And so those railroads were the Wabash, the Norfolk and Western, the Lehigh Valley, Pittsburgh and West Virginia, half interest in the New York and Long Branch and Pennsylvania Reading Seashore lines. It also controlled the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, which had been founded by Henry Ford, controlled the Ann Arbor through the DT&I. At one point, it even controlled the Baltimore and Ohio itself, which was a major competitor. And then, of course, we mentioned a few minutes ago, the Long Island Railroad. But it goes even further than that, because in the 1870s, it got involved with a variety of southeastern capitalists, including William Walters, the father of Henry Walters, and we did an episode on a book about them a few months back, which we will link in the description, because it discusses the Pennsylvania's effort to work with them and several other industrialists of the time to form what was a Southern Railway system. Now, that is not the Southern Railway of 1894, which is also referred to as the Southern Railway system, but this effort was not only helping to rebuild the southeastern railroads after the Civil War, it was also attempting to expand the Pennsylvania's strong presence in the Northeast into the Southeast. Now, that didn't work. It actually collapsed, and so some of the efforts to consolidate these railroads did not happen. But one of the ways that it is impacting the way we live today is it helped foster consolidation overall in the region. And so what happened? That led to the creation of the Atlantic Coastline, or I should say, heavily influenced the creation of the Atlantic Coastline, and also the Seaboard Air Line. And let's also remember, during this period, the Richmond terminal system was growing, and that in 1894, after it was reorganized, became the Southern Railway. So while you may not have had a Pennsylvania Railroad executive sitting in someone's boardroom or office saying, I want you to do this, this, and this, their involvement in consolidating these railroads helped spur more consolidation, and that in many ways has led to the creation of some of the railroads that we have today, and as a result impacted freight movement and the way that we get the goods that we use in our daily lives. And let's also not forget one other thing. We talk about Norfolk Southern. We've kind of said that Pennsylvania helped to influence, in a way, the creation of the Southern Railway, which is the southern half of the Norfolk Southern. Well, let's also not forget the N&W. Of course, the Norfolk and Western for many years ran between Norfolk, Virginia, on Virginia's coast and Chesapeake Bay, to Cincinnati and Columbus, Ohio. But thanks to the Pennsylvania Railroad and its need to get out of control of the N&W because of the impending Penn Central merger, it not only, well, it technically never sold control of the company, although it gradually reduced its influence there, but it also leased to the N&W the Wabash, which the Pennsylvania controlled, and facilitated the merger, the three-way merger between the Wabash, the Nickel Plate, and the N&W, which created the super system that stretched between Norfolk, Virginia on the east and Omaha, Nebraska. A lot of people forget the N&W went as far west as Omaha at one point, because the Wabash's furthest west outpost was Omaha, although it's most commonly associated with Kansas City, Missouri. So that gives you the idea of the impact that it had on the transportation infrastructure, or I should say the arrangement of transportation assets over the years. And yes, it very much does impact the way that we live today. What's also notable is what it's done in terms of supporting our urban areas. Now, you've probably heard of Penn Center. And it's one place that I really enjoyed visiting. I'll show you, those of you who are on CP5 cam, a picture that I took back in September of 2019. That is one Penn Center, which is commonly known as the Transportation Building, and also where Suburban Station is located. And Suburban Station was for many years the terminus of a lot of Pennsylvania Railroad commuter lines that fanned out from downtown Philadelphia. Now you're probably wondering, well, Phil, why are you talking about Suburban Station and Penn Center, and well, what does that have to do with me or what's going on today? Well, it was born of what Stuart Saunders called the Pennsylvania slow liquidation. I believe he said that in No Way to Run a Railroad. And that was this long process that the Pennsylvania undertook, not quite consciously, but in a de facto fashion, where it sold property and monetized it. And that's because the railroad business, as we've talked about in a variety of our episodes, was always a difficult one. At times, it could be up and very strong. It could also be down and very weak. Even carriers like the Pennsylvania had to contend with this, and their exposure to the business cycle was quite a bit more exaggerated than that of the carriers today, like Norfolk Southern and CSX. And that's because, in addition to having highly diversified books of business, which the Pennsylvania did just as its present-day successors, they also have a much wider distribution in terms of geography. That means, while the Pennsylvania might have been suffering a lot when you have customers in the Northeast that might be down on their financial luck, CSX can moderate this a little bit because it's likely that even if some Northeastern customers aren't doing well and they might be closing down, there might be other demand in the Southeast where they also go to balance it out. So this led to the Pennsylvania constantly and other railroads, by the way, constantly needing to be able to fill holes, whether on the capital or operating side of their financial ledgers. And so Stewart called this the slow liquidation, and this really amounted to the closure of Broad Street Station in Philadelphia, which was near City Hall. And by the way, it's interesting, if you go to that area, you'll see the Reading Terminal, which is above Reading Terminal Market. Certainly a place for you rail fan foodies to visit. It is a stub-in terminal that's near City Hall in Philadelphia, and likewise the Pennsylvania also had a stub-in terminal, but it routed its north-south trains through what is now 30th Street Station because it would be very difficult to bring them in and then back them out and get back on the main line. So you had at one point both of these carriers with this big presence in downtown Philadelphia, and then as time went on, of course, that ends up going away because all this track gets put underground. And getting put underground is what led to the creation of Penn Center, which is called, quote, and this is from the Wikipedia article, the heart of Philadelphia's central business district, and it takes its name from the nearly 5 million square feet of office and retail complex it contains. Lies between 15th and 19th Street and the John F. Kennedy Boulevard and Market Street, and it is credited with bringing Philadelphia into the modern era of office buildings. So basically what the Pennsylvania Railroad did, they demolished Broad Street Station, they built Suburban Station, which is right here, just in case you didn't have an opportunity to see it. And you can see there it says Pennsylvania Railroad Suburban Station. The tracks are underground. And then they started using the land from what was called a Chinese wall, a big wall that the railroad tracks were on top of. And if you've been to Newark, New Jersey, you've seen a Chinese wall because that's how the Pennsylvania tracks get through the city of Newark to Penn Station and then on their way to New York City. Also in Washington, D.C., right next to where I work, you have a major Chinese wall because that's the wall that supports the track area of Washington Union Station. So when you hear us refer to Chinese walls in the railroad context, that's a lot of what it means. But Chinese walls, just like the Great Wall of China, are generally seen as being divisive to communities because they're large, and that means they keep people on one side or the other. So as you got into the modern era of urban planning, or I should say into the era of urban planning, you had a lot of people who were looking for ways to get rid of those and put tracks underground. Well, the Pennsylvania liquidated, as in sold off a lot of this property, and this created a lot of office buildings. And some of the tenants who have been in a variety of these buildings in recent years have included Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius, which is in 6 Penn Center. 6 Penn Center, by the way, is where the Pennsylvania moved its headquarters to after Broad Street Station was demolished. That also served as Penn Central's headquarters and the first headquarters of Conrail until 2 Commerce Square was built nearby, and that's where Conrail was when, of course, it operated its final years before its acquisition and breakup. Comcast built an office building of their own in the nearby area. You also have Sunoco, the famous oil company, and FMC, which is a chemical company that's nationally known, and that's just a few of them. You could look at a lot of this building, office building, that's taken place in the area, not just Penn Center itself, but around that being a direct result of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the fact that you had this new emerging knowledge economy, even though we didn't call it that in the 1950s and the 1960s, but where people are using their minds far more than they're using their bodies in order to generate revenue and wealth. This happening in downtown Philadelphia during a time when that region of the country was declining is something that has helped spur the city and maintain its growth and help it to become now a haven for younger people who are looking to have a city experience as they grow up, the so-called kind of trendy lifestyle that you like to see. This all came about because of, yes, you guessed it, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, another example of this is the redevelopment of Penn Station in New York City. Now, this is a sore spot with many people, and rightfully so, because the old Penn Station, which I'm going to put up here on CP5 cam for you, there was truly an architectural masterpiece. One of the things I loved to study in high school was Roman history, and we talked about the baths of Caracalla, the Roman Emperor Caracalla. Well, these Penn Station, the original Penn Station, built in 1910, was patterned after the baths of Caracalla and also of Diocletian, a later Roman emperor. Now, we can get into a whole discussion about whether the baths should have been named for those emperors or earlier emperors who were a little bit more influential in their construction. But you can see that these were very much an architectural masterpiece, the baths originally, and Penn Station, which was patterned after them. Of course, though, despite all of this, passenger trains were in decline even in New York City, even as much as the Pennsylvania was working with other entities like the federal government to try to improve it. And they understood, even if it is quite painful for us to recognize it, that passenger trains were never going to come back to this level of where you had people jamming them. And you could kind of look at it as being analogous to airports today. The majority of people, when they're traveling, are either driving or flying, and therefore the facilities are going to reflect that. That's why airports are so big. But also, you've got to remember that in these times, while architecture was critical and something that the Pennsylvania and other railroads took great pride in, a lot of this was also necessary for the way people moved during that time, and also because the technology of the time. That meant as this went away, a lot of this in terms of size and so forth and scope wasn't all that necessary as we moved on. And as you look at this photo from 1936, I also want you to note that stairway, if you are ever in the current Penn Station, which is the 1963 version, or the mid-1960s version, some of the stairways that you go down are original to the station. And as you look at these, the handrails, you'll be able to see that. So that is a piece of the original Penn Station that is still in existence. But of course, as we know, in another example of slow liquidation, the Pennsylvania sold the air rights above the station to create Madison Square Garden, and this led to this beautiful facility, which at one point was in fact used by many, many people, being destroyed. And here are some photos of the demolition, which are very sad, and so we're going to get them off of your screen. But what was the wider cultural and societal impact of this? Well, first of all, let's look at what people do today by the thousands almost every night throughout the year. And that is go to Madison Square Garden to see teams like the New York Rangers and the New York Knicks play. As part of selling the air rights, the Pennsylvania did receive a minority ownership position in Madison Square Garden and the Pennsylvania itself. And having Madison Square Garden, which has hosted everything from Billy Graham to, of course, the sports teams, is a cultural center in New York City, and it was not always on that location. In fact, Madison Square Garden was originally in Madison Square, and there have been various iterations of that arena in other parts of New York City. But having it there has helped to make sure that area and it has remained vibrant and also been a cultural attraction for people from around the world due to that. None of this would be the case were it not for the Pennsylvania Railroad selling that and ending up constructing this. Now, I know that might be a little bit of a controversial position, but that is something that continues to reverberate for those of us in 2024, long after the Pennsylvania Railroad operated its final train. And in that same respect, let's also think about one unintended consequence of all of this, or another one, which was the creation of the Landmark Preservation Commission. Penn Station's destruction showed us that while we were very much and should very much remain a forward-thinking society that's looking for ways to innovate, that it doesn't make sense to forget about the past. And even though New Yorkers had in many ways deserted the passenger trains which served Old Penn Station, when they saw that it was going to be taken away from them, they sprang into action. There were protests. And this led to, of course, the Landmark Preservation Commission. And I would say that helped to galvanize that movement across the country. So the next time you see an older building, especially one that has either been completely or partially preserved within an area that continues to grow and see new, whether we're talking about office towers or residential buildings, retail or whatnot put up, thank the Pennsylvania Railroad. Although they got it wrong in terms of what happened with Old Penn Station, that helped to change the course of the future in very much a positive way. And one of the earliest examples of that came in the 1970s, when there was the possibility that Grand Central Terminal, of all places, could have been torn down, and it wasn't, largely because of this movement, which in that instance was spearheaded by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, former wife of President John F. or I should say widow of President John F. Kennedy. But she played a key role in it, but a lot of this was spurred because of the destruction of the original Penn Station. Now, there's a broader impact, though, beyond just buildings on the Northeast Corridor area. And I'm not talking about the track, I'm talking about the region stretching from Boston to Washington. The Pennsylvania Railroad worked extensively with the federal government, as well as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, on a variety of projects to modernize the services in this region. The federal government, of course, wanted to promote the growth of high-speed rail, which, of course, we didn't have in the United States in any form at that time. The city of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth city of Philadelphia, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania wanted to see a lot of the commuter services in the Philadelphia and the southeastern Pennsylvania region get modernized because, of course, the Pennsylvania and the Reading, who were the two primary providers and then owned the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, was operating on the New Jersey side, most certainly were in financial decline, and therefore the commuter services that thousands depended on were in decline. Now, all of these projects happened throughout the 1960s, and the most visible is the Metroliner. And you've probably seen the Metroliner, or as they are termed, Capital Liner, multiple unit cars, and we will get an example of that on the CP5 cam for you. These cars were built by Bud, and here we go. So we've got a good photo, and it's always difficult to find good ones in the Pennsylvania Railroad scheme because they didn't wear it that long. But here's an example of it, and this is the tubular design, which in many ways kind of harkens to an airplane fuselage being rounded, whereas in those times, most passenger rail cars had flat sides, and also part of the idea was to hopefully give the passengers a little bit more space right at the center of the car where you might be sitting down. So maybe you could have more space in the aisles and so on. In practice, it really doesn't make that big a difference. In fact, I tend to find more of the slab side cars to be a little bit more comfortable, but that's just me. But the Metroliner was truly an innovative effort to institute high-speed rail, not only in the United States, but in the eastern United States, where it was already so built up by the time railroads were created in the first place. So finding rights of way and being able to have equipment that could handle that would be very difficult. So, of course, utilizing existing rights of way and the Pennsylvania having electrified, which is the main line New York, Philadelphia, and main line Philadelphia, Washington. So this is between New York City and ultimately Potomac Yard in Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia area. That created a great canvas for them to paint this new high-speed rail dream on top of. Now, the Pennsylvania very well could have just said no. After all, one of the big problems when you work with government on a project like this is that the government support for whatever the project may be temporary, but that doesn't mean the expenses that you'll face afterwards won't continue. So just think, if you upgrade track to accept 110, 125, or 150 mile per hour trains passing through, and the Metroliners, I believe their top speed was 186 miles per hour, even though they did not do that in revenue service. That means you will have a higher cost to continue to maintain that infrastructure. So the railroad itself was taking a risk by doing this, and they did. And, they did point out at different times that they had contributed a lot of money to the project, and the federal government did not contribute at the same pace. So that was something that I wouldn't say rankled, but definitely perturbed them a little bit in this, because obviously, as we know, as we've covered a lot in the decline of the Pennsylvania and the Penn Central, cash became incredibly tight because there were so many hands taking cash out of the till. And I don't mean illegally, I mean legally. People, whether you're talking about paying for labor, paying for fuel, and so on. And it was becoming very difficult in the environment of regulated rates to match the expenses with the revenues, because you couldn't say, well, we're going to raise prices on this particular traffic group or otherwise without getting the approval of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And at the same time, they were constantly dealing with the growing interstate highway system, which meant more trucks were able to take more higher value cargo than some of the lower value cargo, such as coal and so on, which is a commodity, and therefore it's going to have not the ability to charge higher prices on a whim the way that you might be able to do it with intermodal. So, one truckload or a couple of truckloads. And I should back up. I shouldn't say on a whim. I should say on a spot basis. And the reason for the difference is it's not just that someone wakes up and says, hey, let's go charge somebody more money. That's what a lot of anti-rail advocates believe. It's the fact that if you do have the ability to earn more revenue for a move, you really need to. And one of the reasons you need to is something that Pennsylvania suffered from, and that was a lack of capital for a lot of the projects that they needed to do, whether it was keeping the existing system operating or investing in upgrades to support the Metroliners. Now, what I really look at is the Metroliners together with the various air shuttles provided by Pan Am and Eastern among the most notable. Later on, you had American, Trump, and I'm trying to remember, I think Delta also had a shuttle. All of those combined to keep the Northeast region viable. But I actually think that the trains played a bigger role, because Pennsylvania Railroad, its routes basically do go downtown to downtown between New York City and Washington, D.C. And therefore, it is not very much of a risk at all for you as somebody who's going to an important meeting in Philadelphia or Washington or New York City to get on the train and get you relatively close to where that meeting is likely to take place. And even if it's taking place in a suburban area, a lot of the connections that went to it, whether we're talking about indirect to lines such as the Erie-Lackawanna, where there were not direct connections until relatively recently, or if you're talking about going to services that are on the Reading in the Philadelphia area, you did have the reasonable ability to use a mass transit product to get you from one point to the other. And this is for your people who are higher up on the food chain in terms of their careers. And so I believe that is one of the things that kept the Northeast to be viable, even though it was declining as a manufacturing center thanks to the growth of the Sun Belt. So that's why, as you look at what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s, you were able for these areas to hold on until you started to see a resurgence in the 1980s and a growth of the knowledge economy, which today is continuing to attract young people to these areas, even though there's very little in the way of manufacturing jobs, and they're certainly not breeding new corporate headquarters or the type of larger offices that may have sustained the area in the past. And thanks to the Pennsylvania maintaining this route and investing in it on its own, this is allowing Amtrak and the people, other commuter agencies and so on, to continue investing, and that will help to create a future. We don't know how bright, but a future for these areas. Now, few things to close us out here. Even though only 35% of the Pennsylvania Railroad, according to Trains Magazine, is left, and that is of that 1925 11,000 plus mile system, for those of us who are rail enthusiasts, we can see a lot of it. A great example, as I mentioned earlier, is the Norfolk Southern. That railroad is primarily there in almost every way, the N&W portion, the Southern portion, and the Conrail portion, because of the Pennsylvania Railroad and a lot of what it did. Second, the Long Island Railroad still, even in the post-COVID era, remains the nation's largest passenger carrier. So think about that. Amtrak might be the largest in terms of the places it serves, but the Long Island has the highest passenger volume, and that is for a relatively small railroad that operates on one portion, and actually two portions now, of the state of New York, because it obviously had gone into Manhattan before. Now it goes up to Grand Central Terminal. So in only a relatively small part of one state, that is the largest passenger carrier in the nation. And one last thing, when you get on the Capital Limited, I want you to think about this. See, Amtrak's current Capital Limited was formed as the Washington section of the Broadway Limited. And back in 1971, Amtrak took over the Broadway Limited from Penn Central. And the Broadway Limited always had some form of a connection between Washington and Harrisburg. And this was similar to what the 20th Century Limited on the New York Central did, where it had a Boston to Albany connection. So this gave another large city that was near the train's route access to that train. Now, when Amtrak took over, it began operating a section to Washington, D.C. that went up through Baltimore and then through Perryville, Maryland, over what's called the Columbia and Port Deposit Line, which is a major artery for Norfolk Southern today, and was, of course, part of the Pennsylvania Railroad. In fact, this was a return of passenger trains to that route that had not seen them in quite some time, and so there are a lot of great pictures from the 1970s of GG1s pulling trains along this route, which is beautiful because it follows the Susquehanna River. Now, over time, though, this became something that Amtrak didn't really see much value in, and they wanted to generate more revenue. So finally, the Baltimore and Ohio and Chesapeake and Ohio, the Chessie system, were willing to then host a passenger train on the route of the Capital Limited between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh. So Amtrak created the current Capital Limited, except that it was really part of the Broadway, and between Pittsburgh and Chicago originally operated as part of that train. This was simply them moving the Washington section of the Broadway Limited off the Pennsylvania onto the B&O. Now, as time went on, the Broadway was discontinued in 1995. Its Washington section, of course, called the Capital Limited, continued to operate and does continue to operate to this day. It was shifted up to the New York Central off of the Pennsylvania Railroad in the, I do believe it was the mid-1990s as well. Early 1990s. And so this began kind of an odyssey that's led us to the current Capital Limited. Now, why am I talking about this as a reflection on the Pennsylvania Railroad? You could really look at the Capital Limited as being the only remnant that's operating of the famous Broadway Limited. And since it was formed as part of the Broadway Limited, it does have a lineage that goes right back to 1902 by the Pennsylvania Railroad. So while it may not look like it, and while the train doesn't operate over the much of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It does run on it between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and also between Hammond, Indiana, and Chicago Union Station. It does operate on the Pennsylvania Railroad, on portions of the Broadway Limited Route, no less. It is very much a vestige of the great Pennsylvania that you can see on a daily basis on the tracks. Now, in a few months, and I say a few months for a reason, we will eventually do a review of the Centennial history of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and that is 1846 to 1946. This book was published by the Pennsylvania itself, and it has close to 700 pages of very, very closely spaced type. So it will take me, even as a voracious reader, quite a bit of time to get there, but we will review it and we will talk about it, and I will also put it in the show bibliography that we have today. So we will see you down the main line back on Wednesday for our next episode. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for remembering the Pennsylvania and reflecting on it today. And I hope you have a great day.